You can always tell when a child has found a new role model. Oh, they don't walk into the kitchen with a PowerPoint presentation and announce it. No, that would be too considerate. Instead, one day your sweet little boy suddenly starts speaking like a motivational speaker who owns 3 rented sports cars and has alpha in his bio. Or your daughter, who used to laugh at silly cartoons, now looks emotionally exhausted at 13 because some influencer convinced her that every pore on her face is a personal failure. And parents? Parents usually notice the attitude first, the eye rolls, the strange slang, the sudden disrespect, the obsession, the personality transplant. But here's the uncomfortable part nobody likes to admit. Children almost never attach themselves to the wrong role model by accident. Something about that person is feeding an emotional hunger. Maybe confidence, maybe belonging, maybe rebellion, maybe attention. Maybe the feeling of finally looking cool enough in a world where kids feel judged every 5 seconds. And the worst thing a parent can do in that moment? Panic loudly. Because the second you insult the role model without understanding why your child admires them, your child stops hearing your concern and starts preparing for battle like a tiny unpaid defense attorney. I've watched parents turn ordinary teenage phases into full emotional wars simply because they focused on controlling behavior before understanding the emotional need underneath it. And trust me, once a child feels emotionally misunderstood, the wrong people suddenly start sounding very right. When people talk about bad role models, they usually imagine some dramatic villain sitting in a dark room corrupting children like a cartoon mastermind. Real life is far less theatrical and honestly much more dangerous. Most unhealthy role models become influential because they offer children something emotionally attractive before parents even realize there's a gap. That's the part many adults miss. Children and teenagers are psychologically built to imitate. Their brains are still developing identity, social ranking awareness, emotional regulation, and self worth. In simple English, they're trying to figure out who they are while simultaneously worrying whether the world thinks they matter. That combination can make almost anybody charismatic if they appear confident enough. I once knew a quiet 14-year-old boy, we'll call him Marcus, who became obsessed with this loud online personality who treated kindness like a contagious disease. Every sentence sounded like a threat, every opinion sounded angry, and somehow the child thought this man was the definition of strength. Now, from the outside, adults saw arrogance. Marcus saw confidence. That distinction matters because children often don't admire the whole person. They admire the emotional outcome that person seems to have achieved. The insecure child admires certainty. The lonely child admires popularity. The anxious child admires fearlessness. The ignored child admires attention. The powerless child admires dominance. And social media has turned this psychological process into a 24-hour buffet of personalities. When we were younger, your questionable influence might have been one rebellious kid at school with a bad haircut and worse decision-making skills. Today, a child can consume thousands of opinions, behaviors, attitudes, and lifestyles before breakfast. That's a completely different psychological environment. And teenagers, especially, are vulnerable because their brains are heavily wired towards social validation. Scientifically speaking, adolescent brains respond strongly to peer approval, status, novelty, and emotional stimulation. That's why some kids will ignore excellent advice from loving parents, but immediately absorb nonsense from somebody wearing sunglasses indoors while shouting into a microphone. The brain says, this person looks admired. This person looks powerful. People pay attention to them. Maybe copying them will make me matter too. Now add insecurity to that equation. Take young girls dealing with appearance pressure online. Some become attached to influencers who constantly push impossible beauty standards, fake perfection, or emotionally exhausting lifestyles. Suddenly, a child who used to enjoy life casually is now analyzing her face like she's preparing for a forensic investigation. Or consider kids who idolize rebellious classmates. Not because rebellion itself is impressive, most of the time it's just loudly making bad decisions, but because rebellion can look emotionally powerful to children who feel invisible or controlled. That's why simply saying, stop watching that person rarely works. You're not just removing content, you're trying to remove a psychological solution. And if parents don't understand what emotional need the role model is satisfying, the child usually finds another version of the same influence somewhere else. Different face, same emotional hook. That's the trap. This is where most parents unknowingly make things worse. And I say this with full understanding of how frustrating it feels to watch a child drift towards something you don't respect. The first instinct is usually control. Shut it down, ban it, confiscate the device, insist on a serious talk. Sometimes even mock the role model. Is this who you're copying now? And emotionally, it makes sense. You're reacting to what looks like influence slipping out of your hands. But psychologically, that approach often backfires. There's a concept in adolescent psychology called psychological reactance. Basically, when people feel their freedom is being threatened, they instinctively push back harder to reclaim it. Teenagers are especially sensitive to this because part of their developmental job is building independence, even if they do it in chaotic ways. So when a parent says, you are not allowed to watch this person again, the teenager's brain doesn't just hear a rule. It hears, you are not smart enough to decide what influences you. And suddenly, the role model is no longer just an influencer. They become a symbol of freedom. I've seen this play out in very ordinary homes. A parent bans a content creator on Monday, and by Friday, the child has already found loopholes, backup accounts, secret viewing times, or friends who can reintroduce the same content. Not because the child is rebellious for fun, but because the emotional attachment wasn't addressed. Another common mistake is ridicule. Parents sometimes try to wake the child up by tearing down the role model. That person is useless. They are fake. They are stupid. How can you admire nonsense like this? The problem is that to the child, you're not just criticizing a stranger, you're attacking something they currently associate with identity. So instead of reflection, what you get is defense, and defensiveness shuts down learning. The irony is that many of these role models don't even need to be good to be influential. They only need to be emotionally effective. If a child feels understood by them, even in a distorted way, that bond becomes sticky. There was a situation I remember clearly with a teenage girl who had become deeply attached to a beauty influencer who promoted unrealistic standards and constant self criticism disguised as self improvement. The mother's first reaction was anger. The second was strict restriction. The third was a long lecture about self worth. But the child didn't change. What did change was the secrecy. She simply learned how to consume the same content quietly without discussion. And that's the hidden danger. When influence goes underground, parents lose visibility, not the problem. So the real question isn't, how do I stop this immediately? It's what emotional need is being met here that I haven't been addressing. Because until that question is answered, every attempt at control just pushes the child closer to the very influence you're trying to remove. If you strip away the emotion and frustration, what you usually find underneath all of this is surprisingly simple. The child is not attached to the person, they are attached to a feeling. That distinction changes everything. When a child clings to a questionable role model, they are often trying to solve an internal problem they don't yet have language for. It is rarely about logic. It is about emotional compensation. A child who feels invisible will gravitate toward anyone who looks loudly seen. A child who feels powerless will gravitate toward anyone who looks in control of everything around them. A child who feels not enough will gravitate toward anyone who appears effortlessly confident, even if that confidence is built on arrogance or distortion. This is where many parents miss the turning point. They focus on the behavior instead of the underlying emotional gap. So instead of asking, "Why are you copying that person?" which usually triggers defensiveness, a more effective approach starts with curiosity about the emotional reward, not interrogation. Curiosity, something like, "What do you like about them?" Now, here's where something interesting happens psychologically. When children explain their admiration in their own words, they start separating traits without realizing it. They might say, "He doesn't care what people think." At first glance, that sounds like endorsement of a problematic personality. But if you look deeper, what the child is actually admiring is emotional independence, the feeling of not being judged. That's your entry point, because now you're not fighting a person anymore. You're engaging a need, and needs can be redirected. Another practical shift is learning to separate traits from behavior. A role model might demonstrate confidence, but also display cruelty. The goal is not to attack the entire figure, because that forces the child into total defense. The goal is to help the child start distinguishing, "This part looks strong, but this part is harmful." That internal separation is a developmental skill. Once a child learns it, influence becomes less dangerous because everything they consume gets filtered through evaluation instead of blind imitation. Now, replacing influence doesn't happen through lectures, it happens through environment. Children don't just absorb what they are told, they absorb what they repeatedly experience. If a child is surrounded only by criticism at home but finds encouragement online, guess where they will emotionally lean? If a child finds discipline at home but emotional recognition elsewhere, that outside source becomes very powerful. So instead of only removing a bad influence, you also have to introduce stronger, healthier emotional alternatives. That could be a coach who builds discipline without humiliation, a teacher who gives recognition without pressure, a relative who listens without judgment, or structured activities where the child experiences competence and belonging. It is not about replacing one celebrity with another. It is about replacing emotional emptiness with emotional stability. And perhaps the most overlooked part, consistency. One calm conversation does not undo months of influence. One emotional outburst does not correct direction. Children adjust through repeated patterns, not single events. The goal is not to win an argument about the role model. The goal is to slowly become a more reliable source of emotional clarity than whatever they are currently attached to. At the end of the day, what looks like a child choosing a bad role model is often just a child trying to make sense of themselves in a world that feels loud, fast, and confusing. And that's the part many adults overlook. It's easy to focus on the behavior, the slang, the attitude, the obsession with certain influencers. But underneath all of that is usually a simple emotional search. Who am I supposed to be, and who do I become to be accepted? When children latch on to the wrong influence, it's rarely because they want to go off track. It's because that influence seems to offer something they are currently missing: confidence, attention, identity, or a sense of control. So the real shift for parents is not panic or punishment, it's awareness. Awareness of what the child is trying to feel, awareness of what gap that influence is filling, and awareness that removing something without replacing the emotional need often doesn't solve anything. The strongest correction is not domination, it's connection. When a child feels understood, they become far less dependent on external voices to define them. When they learn how to question what they consume instead of copying it blindly, influence loses its power. And that's the real goal here. Not raising children who never get influenced, but raising children who can recognize influence without losing themselves to it. If you've ever dealt with a situation like this, where a child's admiration started affecting their behavior, share your experience in the comments. I do go through them, and I may respond or expand on real situations in future episodes. And if this helped you understand things a little differently, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more parenting and adolescent psychology breakdowns like this.